If one of the heaviest criticisms levied against Jotun was that it had too few enemies, then Thunder Lotus Games probably overcorrected when they made Sundered. First released in mid-2017, Sundered puts you in the dusty boots of a wandering scavenger, Esh, who's out in what appears to be a normal desert sandstorm looking for shelter. What she finds instead is the humming eldritch ghost of a cathedral, reminiscent of something designed by Zdzisław Beksinski, before being pulled underground by inky black tentacles. After a brief tutorial zone where you learn to move, jump, and dodge, you drop into a large chamber where you find a strange crystalline artifact that calls itself the Shining Trapezohedron. If you're familiar with the works of H.P. Lovecraft, then the introduction of this character would be an immediate red flag, but his dialogue and intonation should be enough to tell you that he's probably not trustworthy. Still, you can't exactly proceed without him either, as the Shining Trapezohedron is also your main weapon, a transforming sword, axe, hammer thing, as well as your main guide. In the tutorial zone above, you encountered some strange crawling electrical monsters, and your only option was to avoid them. Going forwards and downwards, you'll be facing off against much, much worse than those things. I think Sundered is best described as a 2D hack and slasher with a death-based progression system, all while exploring a hostile and constantly changing underground world. There are other words you might use to describe this game, such as
Metroidvania
or
Roguelite,
but I'll talk about those later in the video. Suffice to say that I think Sundered is something of a genre orphan, to turn a phrase by Noah Gervais, and if you go into the game with a certain expectation, you might end up having a bad time compared to if you had no expectations at all. That isn't to say that you should blindly buy the game though. For this reason, I'll go on a bit further about how this game works before I give my recommendation and get into spoiler territory, so that you can hopefully see for yourself and decide if this is going to be your kind of game. As I said, once you acquire the Shining Trapezohedron, who I'll hereby be referring to as ST, you'll also gain the ability to attack. You have a 3-attack combo that ends in a big smash, and if you attack enough times in quick succession and without interruption, you'll get a finisher move that does massive damage. You also have a downward slash, a drop attack, and a mid-air upward slash that actually gives you a little bit of extra air. There are 7 main abilities that you'll pick up throughout your journey at these beautiful shrines of weeping masked figures, 3 in the first region and 2 in each of the game's other main regions. These are a recharging shield, a double jump, a high damage limited use cannon, a chargeable smash attack, an air dash, wall running shoes, and a grappling hook. All of these add to your character's mobility in some way, as well as helping you in combat, because the gun has massive recoil, and the shield lets you bounce off of environmental spikes for a second. The world is semi-procedurally generated. That means that the broad strokes are the same on each run and each playthrough, and the map shows these with large grey rectangles, and highlights important locations with special symbols. But the interconnecting rooms are always different and rearrange themselves every time you die. The creators of Sundered called this procedurally handcrafted, and I think it works better than I initially thought it would. Basically, each room can only connect to other rooms in the same region in a limited number of ways, so once one room has been generated, the list of rooms you could see next can only be chosen from a set list, and that affects the list for the next room, and so on. If you're looking for more information about the technicalities of how this works, the search term you want to use is wave function collapse. Along with this element of randomness, there's also the enemy monsters, which rather than being placed in those individually generated cells in a repeatable pattern, will instead show up at any time and come from any direction. Barring bosses, mid-bosses, and challenge rooms, all of the enemies in this game will spawn in and attack you this way. It'll only be the odd crawler or scout at first, but the longer you stay alive, the more frequent and numerous the waves become. Periodically, a cacophony of rabid monsters will be thrown your way in an event known as a horde, and certain zones will have endless hordes in them that will not stop hounding you until you leave or die. The only thing that makes this manageable is the fact that most enemies can't harm you until they start their attack animations, and there really is only a handful of attack patterns. There's the lunging, swarming enemies, the burst damage enemies, the I hope you like environmental damage enemies, the you better dodge this guys, the shooting and flying enemies, and the haha, come get me enemies. There's some decent crossover between those loose categories, as you can probably imagine, but the design of each creature is quite unique and fitting for the area that you find them in. The combat challenges emerge from the specific combinations of enemies that show up and the kind of room you find yourself in when they do. Are you in a nice wide corridor, a dense labyrinth, or a vertical minefield of spiked plants and megaton pistons? The same enemies in each of those locations could produce very different results in terms of how difficult those fights would be. Most of the combat in this game then revolves around positioning. If you stand in one place and spam attacks, you'll most likely die. The trick is to stay calm and keep moving. You get into a rhythm with it eventually, getting out a combo, jumping or dodging, hitting a few more times, run back, give your shield a chance to recharge, unleash a finisher, dodge again, start another combo, and save your cannon attack for giant swarms or emergencies. This probably sounds pretty exhausting, and, well, yeah, it is. This world is hostile to you. You may think that these creatures are abnormal, but truly you are the alien. And every time an alarm sounds or gong chimes, signaling that another horde is coming for you, you're starkly reminded of that fact. Death usually comes as a relief, both because it gives you a chance to actually breathe, and because you'll finally be able to spend all the shards that you've been picking up. Shards are this game's word for experience points. You use them to choose passive stats and ability upgrades from a large interwoven web in the Sanctuary. These are linearly powerful but progressively expensive. For example, a melee damage upgrade always gives you +3 damage, and the cost of the upgrade could only be 100 shards in the early game, but thousands by the end of it. Skill webs are a bit of an odd thing, I think, especially in contrast to skill trees, which lock you down a specific path. They mean that you'll very likely end up filling out the whole web by the time you reach the end of the game, or I did in Sundered anyway. So the only choice you're really making is what order to take the upgrades in. Everyone will start and end the same, and the highest amount of player expression between two playthroughs will actually be in the mid-game, and even then it'll depend mainly on which perks you've found. Perks are special passives that usually grant you very specific buffs, but also inflict you with a penalty. Perks are almost always worth equipping though, as the reward usually outweighs the risks. This makes perks the most interesting part of the game's character building options, in my opinion. They're randomly dropped by high-level golden lith enemies, golden treasure chests, and preset perk shrines, usually located at the end of an endless horde zone. The perks you choose can completely change the way you play though. I found a perk early on in my playthrough that gave me extra elixirs but changed them into shield elixirs, and then I found another perk that converted a portion of my maximum health into shields, but also meant that if I lost all my shields I would simply die. With this in mind, because shields regenerate and health doesn't, I was able to take more risks whilst also dying less often than I might have otherwise, and I ended up corrupting my shield ability first and used a fairly shield-focused build to get me through most of the second region as a result of this. Then a bit later I switched to a critical damage-focused build once I found the Assassin perk, whereas in my second playthrough I found the Assassin perk almost immediately. So the game's core cycle revolves around exploring, fighting, dying, upgrading, and then heading out and trying again, using what you've learned to get deeper and deeper into the catacombs. Though it may seem at first like you can never learn anything, since the game map keeps changing every time you die, I found that over time I started to build up a familiarity with the individual rooms and how to navigate them. Instead of remembering the map as a whole, I just remembered the individual pieces. I learned where the treasures were and how to best jump over or dodge each obstacle and the quickest route through whilst backtracking. Towards the end of the game, I actually felt that this added a bit of narrative harmony between myself and the main character. As I learned to navigate the twisted halls, Esh was becoming more familiar with her eldritch powers too. Our metaphoric minds grew closer in sync, and the chaos of this broken world became fathomable. So, if that all sounds like fun, then here's my recommendation. I think this is a really good game once you know what you're in for. It can also be tough as nails, but I think getting through it is pretty rewarding in its own right. There are 4 difficulties, but hard and insane just make enemies do more damage, spawn more often, and drop less shards. And I don't think this really makes the game that much harder. It just takes longer. It means that you have to do more tedious grinding to get to the same power level as you would be on an easier difficulty. And I think the limited number of enemy types will have more than worn out their welcome by then. I would have preferred to see a New Game Plus or an Eldritch mode, where ideally the whole skill web would be unlocked and only perks and abilities would reset, and then you could do away with shards entirely and substantially raise the difficulty of the game and balance the whole thing around knowing that every player has the same stats and access to the same abilities. Apparently the devs wanted to do something like this, but just didn't have time. As such, I can't really recommend playing on any difficulty harder than normal, and I did my second playthrough on easy just to make it go faster. The funny thing is, because I was rushing through my second playthrough, I actually had a harder time with some of the fights than I did on normal, simply because I hadn't collected as many shards. My normal playthrough, where I embraced corruption and got 100% completion, took about 16 hours, whereas my easy playthrough, in which I resisted, took just over 7 hours. Though it's worth mentioning that my knowledge of the game from the first playthrough was probably the biggest factor that brought that number down, not the difficulty. From now on, I'll be talking about and showing spoilers, including the story and bosses, so feel free to drop the video here and go and see if the game's on sale or whatever. Let's talk about the story for a bit. Unlike Tora, Esh has no voice in this game, and her backstory and reasons for being in the desert at the start of the game are only described on the game's original Kickstarter page. In days gone by, this sort of information might have been included in the game's manual. She also does have a voice, as heard in the game's official trailer, but none of anything she says there makes it into the game itself.
This infernal place has taken me hostage. I keep coming close to death, but this world is keeping me alive.
Whether the devs planned to include more about Esh in the game and ran out of time or budget, or whether they changed their minds and intentionally left Esh a little more blank so that the player could project onto her, I'm not entirely sure, but I choose to believe that it's the latter, because it means that the choices you make throughout the game aren't hers, they're yours. The chthonic world we find ourselves in consists of the stray remnants of a once bustling and ancient civilization known as the Eschaton, and the industrious efforts of invading human forces who call themselves the Valkyrie. Whether this takes place in a version of our own universe or in another dimension isn't entirely clear to me, but the technology that the Valkyrie use is definitely in the realm of science fantasy. Most of the enemies you fight in the Valkyrie base are robots and drones, for example, automated defense systems that have woken up when you turned the power on. There are drips and drabs of lore that you can read in the skill web whenever you get a new ability, big skill, or perk. These are more like scraps of old database entries, quotes, and proverbs, mostly written from the Valkyrie's perspective. They do tell a story of their own, though. An immortal Eschaton pontifactrix known as Ishchela Bagor brought prosperity to her people, but the, quote, corruption of men who had corroded the world, as the shining trapezohedron puts it, forced Ishchela's hand to turn to a dark god for help. That god was Nyarlathotep, and he gifted her a stone that contained the shining trapezohedron. With the power of the stone, she was able to open portals to Nyarlathotep's world, where they exchanged powers from the outer gods in return for sacrifices. As you explore the game world, you'll find vistas similar to those found in Jotun, when the shining trapezohedron will say something to you about what you see. For example, here's a statue of Ishkhela Bakor in one of the first areas you visit, but most of the exposition is delivered when you find these large crystals that fill with blood whilst the trapezohedron speaks through them. It's important to note that the shining trapezohedron is an unreliable narrator and heavily biases his descriptions of events to put the Eschaton in a good light. The shining trapezohedron admires the Valkyries' brain for science, but says that they're stubbornly foolish. And this is shown to be true in the database entries too, as in spite of their discoveries, they don't seem to want to believe that the holy stone that Ishkhela is using is what's enabling them to connect between dimensions. ST tells us that one day a priest named Kurhal Mirlach found a way to protect the Eschaton from the corrosion, until the Valkyries arrived with, quote, eyes full of greed and hearts empty of belief, asking for power. Kurhal and the Eschaton resisted them, and the Valkyrie retaliated with war and espionage, until Kurhal gave in and lost his dominion. The word Valkyrie is one we've already heard earlier in this video, but the Valkyrie of Sundered don't seem to bear any relation to the Valkyries of Jotun. The word itself translates to chooser of the slain, or wish fulfiller, although you can see the Valknut appear above Escha's head while she meditates. I think this is just an Easter egg. The Eschaton holy city was then defiled by the Valkyrie and their unholy technology, as the shining trapezohedron puts it. And when you visit the holy city yourself, the enemies you fight there are the remaining Eschaton, tentacled aberrations, swarming black masses of teeth and tongues, and alien magicians, who are still summoned to defend their city from invaders when the gong strikes. The word eschaton in Greek means the last or the utmost, but it is most likely also a reference to the day at the end of time in the New Testament of the Bible, when God is said to decree the ultimate fates of all living beings. During the war, a Valkyrie named Emmett Nelson snuck through the city's defenses and massacred the Eschaton's women and children, and then fell into hysteria. Then, the holy city's cathedral was broken into by a Valkyrie general named Leonard Waters, whilst Ishkhela Bakor was trying to open a portal that would free Nyarlathotep into this world and cleanse it of the corruption. The priestess and general fought, interrupting the ritual and causing dimensions to collide and shattering reality into madness. The general lost his legion, and the priestess lost the Eschaton their salvation, and the surface world fell into apocalypse. The creatures you fight in the cathedral are the true monsters, men, machine, and Eschaton that all merged or mutated when the ritual of salvation was interrupted and reality broke. They are all insane in their own ways, but I can't help feel sorry for them. The holy stone was shattered in the ritual too, into what we collect throughout the game as Elder Shards. It's not entirely clear, but I think our weapon is one of the Elder Shards too, but it's the only one that contains the consciousness of the shining trapezohedron. The creatures remaining in the catacombs, quote, fought for scraps of power, and shattered some of the other Elder Shards even further in the process, creating the Minibosses. Despite ST saying this, we never actually see the two factions fighting each other in-game though, which I think is a shame. The 5 main characters in this story, or what remains of them, are the main bosses that you fight in each region. They got the lion's share of the Elder Shards, and thus the most power too. Like in Jotun, these bosses are typically gargantuan monstrosities that put everything you've learned to the test. There are 5 main bosses, 9 mini-bosses, and 1 optional boss. Each main boss is fought in its respective region, and can be seen on the map at all times as a big red skull once you've located its approximate location. When a main boss dies, the Shining Trapezohedron reminds you that you can corrupt your abilities with the Elder Shards to make your fights more easy in the future. If it's not obvious, this is a Faustian bargain, but it's not yet clear what you're trading off when you make the choice to corrupt an ability. If you explore the Valkyrie base thoroughly, you'll also find an incinerator that the Shining Trapezohedron tries to forbid you from using. The mini-bosses are marked by smaller skulls, and each one drops an Elder Shard fragment, which combined with 2 others will make a whole Elder Shard. These mini-bosses are technically optional depending on which ending you want to get, and their designs aren't as exciting as the main bosses. They're just jacked up versions of standard enemies that you'll fight throughout the game, which is a shame but an understandable constraint. Although the game tells you in a loading screen that the first 3 bosses can be fought in any order, I think most people will still fight them in the order that I did, unless they're really struggling on one or the other. So let's go through them now in that order. The Valkyrie base is made up of winding concrete paths, steel pipes and catwalks, and the occasional greenery. There's enough vertical space in most rooms to move around freely whilst you're still learning your abilities. Your objective here is just to get the power back on and to fight through the progressively more hostile automated systems that the Valkyrie set up to keep Dominion at bay. When you get to Dominion, you see the towering body of Kurchal Mirlach, who appears to be somewhat human. I'm not sure if this implies that Kurchal was a Valkyrie traitor who joined the Eschaton, or whether the Eschaton were once a lot more human-looking until they started worshipping Nyarlathotep. In either case, Kurchal puts on the Eschaton mask, and his whole chair is raised aloft by tentacles, whilst the 3 Elder Shards burst from his body. Hitting these Elder Shards is the only way you can damage the bosses in this game, and each phase progresses once you deal about 1/3 of their health. This means you can't cheese a boss fight by attacking all 3 shards down to a smidge of health in the first phase, and then blast through the second and third phases with a single hit each. Dominion's attack start off by summoning these large fists from out of portals, and they can appear almost anywhere, or in complex patterns that you have to dodge whilst you jump up the platforms to get to his weak spots. Periodically, he'll also teleport around the battlefield, and in the second phase he starts summoning crawlers to defend him. The third phase just amps up the rate of attacks and the number of spawning crawlers to 11. All in all, it's a pretty straightforward first boss, but these are also quite long fights. Each attempt can take over 5 minutes if you include the run back each time. The Eschaton city is a labyrinthine mess of small interconnecting rooms and corridors that feel carved out of living stone. It's dark and cramped, and could perhaps even trigger some claustrophobia in you. The game is testing your mettle here more than anything. Every time the gong chimes in this area, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I never felt safe here. Your objective is simply to find your way through the maze where Hysteria is hiding. Hysteria is the mangled corpse of the war criminal Emmett Nelson, whose body has suffused with his mechanical tank. This fight is a lot more complicated than the first, and took me about an hour of attempts, I think. It starts off simple enough, dodging his slam attacks and lasers and jumping on the floating platforms to get to the Elder Shards. He shoots at you with little turrets whilst you're being thrown about though, which can be especially tough to deal with if you don't have the skill upgrade that lets you attack bullets to destroy them. In the second phase, these pillars of glowing light appear as well, which can drag you down to the ground in an instant if you don't air dash through them. I couldn't really tell a difference between his second and third phases, but I guess he just gets faster and the turrets are more numerous. I think this boss is all about checking whether you've learned to do aerial combat properly, and the trick of staying afloat whilst in the air by interspersing your attacks with jumps, because you'll be needing this skill in the third and final region, the Cathedral. Getting to the Cathedral was initially disheartening for me, because you enter it through a series of cramped dugout tunnels filled with poison gas plants, and I was really worried that the whole area was just going to be another dense maze. But it quickly opens up into a very airy, vertically focused region with interconnecting elevators that make backtracking a lot easier, and thankfully you don't take fall damage. This is where the game really tests your platforming skills, as there's a strong wind that can blow you off course, and a creeping cloud of corruption that kills you if you stray too close. Eventually, you'll find 4 keys that you use to unlock the gate to Legion and Salvation. Legion and Salvation, or Rivalry as they're collectively called, are a slightly different boss from the rest. The fight begins with the broken body of Leonard Waters reaching out to you for help before being sucked into a machine with Eschaton Bakor. The two rise up into the shining keyhole and then split into separate floating parts. You have to attack one of the 2 Elder Shards that hang from their bodies to disable the shields around the main Elder Shard in the center of the room, and attacking this central shard is the only way to actually damage them. At the halfway point, Rivalry starts shooting tons of slow-moving bullets whilst floating around too, much like a bullet hell type of game. The battlefield is full of grappling hooks that help you to maneuver, but Legion and Salvation's attacks can be pretty relentless and difficult to dodge. I found that this really tested my patience, but mostly in a good way. I found that if I tried to rush their health down, I would die every time, so the fight is about creating good opportunities to get your attacks in, and dodging expertly between those moments. All in all, I think this is the longest and hardest boss fight in the game. A nice touch, I thought, was that when they're defeated, Leonard kills himself and Eschaton gets sucked into the Outer Gods dimension. This is a subtle nod to the possible endings of the game, I think, rejecting the darkness and dying, or being fully corrupted and losing control. I also noticed in my second playthrough that when you first enter the incineration chamber, the Shining Trapezohedron refers to Leonard as an old fool for commissioning such a device, and you can also see what looks like his corpse leaning against it. I confirmed that this must actually be his body because it disappears after you open the cathedral. I'm not too sure of the implications here, but my working theory is that Leonard wanted to incinerate himself after the ritual failed, perhaps hoping that it would destroy the Elder Shard inside of him. And then he crawled all the way down to the incinerator, got this close, and then died. Then, when we unlock the cathedral, his body is transported back to the epicenter of the disaster and resurrected to become Legion. Anyway, Hanoscha Iskot, Magnet of the Gong, is the optional boss found at the very bottom of the Holy City, and he can only be fought once you've found all 3 masks, which are sealed behind their own challenges. There's a puzzle box with lasers, an aerial combat challenge, and a platforming portal challenge whilst being chased by an endless horde. Each mask gives its own powerful upgrade as well, and once you've found all 3, you can also find a 4th special skill at the end of the game's most difficult horde zone, which lets you do a powerful stabbing attack at the end of a roll. Hanoscha is the most normal of the bosses, I would say. He's a powerful Eschaton monk who slams you with a giant gong. As far as I can tell, he's also the only enemy in the game that can interrupt your finisher, which really forces you to change the way you fight him. Just spamming attacks won't work, and during the fight, if you or he attack one of the gongs that surround you, then it summons a wave of Eschaton to come and fight by his side. So you have to be careful about where you attack him from, and if you run away for too long, he'll just start slamming the gongs himself. In his second phase, he rings all of the gongs at once and summons a massive horde of monsters to come and attack you for the rest of the battle. Hanoscha drops a perk which makes it possible to find tier 4 perks when equipped too, but it also cuts your health and damage by a third. I never tried hunting for tier 4 perks personally, but the fight with him was really fun. As with Jotun, a sizable number of people who own this game haven't actually beaten the first boss. The Steam stats are 29.3% for Dominion at time of writing, but the fall-off isn't as bad for the other 2, which are sitting at 22% and 17% respectively. This feels a little more expected, considering that it takes a few hours to reach Dominion, and you'll probably have a much better idea of what the game is like and if you like it by that point. The number that have beaten the game is harder to quantify because it depends on which choices you've made, but it's between 6 and 10%. These choices also affect what the final bosses are and which ending you get. When you get back to the sanctuary after killing all 3 bosses, you can open a portal into the Nether, a pitch-black chamber where you fight 3 hordes of enemies from each of the 3 regions of the main game, and then face off against the final boss. If you're indecisive and use some of the Elder Shards to corrupt your powers and decide to burn the rest, or if you fail to find all 7 of them, then you'll fight the body of the outer god Nyarlathotep, who is still halfway trapped in the portal that the ritual opened all those centuries ago. He starts the fight by blindly swiping at you, but soon starts summoning giant flaming black skulls that do massive damage. These can interrupt your grapple pulls and are really annoying to deal with. They are dodgeable, but eventually I found it easier to just bait them to target somewhere above me and then drop down. In his second phase, he starts shooting lasers in every direction too, which probably looks more chaotic than it really is. I found these surprisingly manageable compared to the fireballs, and he rarely does both at the same time. When he dies, the shining trapezohedron screams, and Esh escapes through the closing portal. If you embrace the Elder Shards and corrupt all of your 7 abilities, then you'll instead fight yourself. The last rational piece of Esh's own psyche manifests in the Nether to try and kill herself. This is a really cool duel, and was a great surprise for many players, I'm sure. What I especially like about it is how it shows completely through gameplay how powerful and other you've become. And a nice touch is that there's no music here at all. The fight isn't especially hard, it's more of a warm-up for the real final boss, but you see that Esh is using all of the abilities you started with, whilst you're leaping around like a brutal nightmare. Then something amazing and kind of frightening happens. Of all the potentially disturbing imagery in the game, I think this is the most shocking. When you defeat Esh, the last remnant of her humanity tears itself out of her and starts trying to kill you too. At this point, if you hadn't already, you see what you've really become. Humanity hugs the walls of the side of this boss arena whilst the floor crumbles beneath your feet into the abyss. Both the chamber and the boss fight are designed knowing that you have all 7 corrupted abilities, and it puts all of your skills to the test, as thorny, eyeball-covered fractal tendrils spew out from a blighted seed that the boss pukes across the arena. You have to dodge whilst flying and grappling, and humanity dives up and down to strike at you. All the while, one final Elder Crystal floats around the chamber with the silhouette of Esh trapped inside. The music is just a heavy electronic drone interspersed with humanity's screams. At this point, if you'll excuse the expression, this is shit as fuck. Do I mean shit as fuck? Maybe I mean shit as fuck. It's a pretty good fight too, although in the second phase they just shift to spewing the tendrils and jumping across the arena in faster and faster succession. And I quickly learned that you will die if you accidentally do a drop attack in this arena. When you finally get the last hit on the crystal, it shatters, and the shining trapezohedron laughs maniacally. Your last task is to press the attack button to kill Esh. If you resist by finding and destroying all 7 shards, then you'll fight Nyarlathotep again, but this time there's a third phase. Once you think you've defeated him, the shining trapezohedron pulls himself from your grip and returns to its master. He was the mind of Nyarlathotep all along, and it fuses with the body to resurrect it. It's at this point that you may remember that the Shining Trapezohedron has been your main weapon for the entire game, so you have to rely exclusively on your Valkyrie cannon in this final phase. Luckily, he shoots projectiles at you that drop ammo canisters when your cannonballs hit them, and I don't know how I feel about this. From a gameplay point of view, it mostly makes sense, but narratively, it means that his downfall at your hand is kind of partly his own fault. But it's actually a really easy final phase, at least it was for me. In either case, as he dies, we'll see all these shape-shifting faces of Nyarlathotep, and then he explodes. But the portal shatters too, and Esh is left behind in the Nether. The Shining Trapezohedron shows up in a number of Lovecraftian tales as an object of power, but it's first and most prominently seen in a trilogy of novels co-written by H.P. Lovecraft and Robert Bloch, The Shambler from the Stars, The Haunter of the Dark, and The Shadow from the Steeple, which I haven't read, so I can't really comment on. Lovecraft summarized the story of the trilogy as an abnormally linked trinity of entities, a brother, twin sister, and their incredibly ancient house, all sharing a single soul and meeting one common dissolution at the same moment. Which sounds kind of similar to the backstory of Sundered, at least at a surface level. But whether the devs read these stories for inspiration or not, I have no idea. More interesting, I think, is Nyarlathotep. Nyarlathotep also shows up regularly elsewhere in the Lovecraftian mythos, usually as a shadowy, messianic figure who influences human cultures to bend to his will across the millennia. He is the cosmic manifestation of intelligent evil. To me, his most impactful appearance is the poem Nemesis, which seems to be written about him, but also told from his perspective. I'm not entirely sure if it's supposed to be autobiographical or just like an aberrant thought that infected the mind of some unfortunate muse, but still, go read it. It's pretty short, or actually, better yet, go listen to the Billy Joel adaptation of the poem as a song. I'll leave a link in the doobly-doo. It's genuinely, unironically great. Still, most of Lovecraft's outer gods are kind of unfathomable. The horror of cosmic horror is mainly based in the realization that the universe doesn't care about you, or us, or anything. Not all of Lovecraft's writing falls into this category, though, and most of the stories that he and others have written that contain Nyarlathotep almost always present him as the villain. Sometimes as a metaphor for the evils of commercialism, often as a stand-in for the self-destructive nature of man's hyper-rationality, and seldom just as a true and proper evil-as-fuck guy. I think this pretty definitively marks the Resistance ending as the best ending in Sundered. Assuming that he really is dead, the removal of Nyarlathotep from the universe benefits everyone. Esh surely dies alone in the darkness of the Nether, but she dies knowing that something on the scale of this tragedy can never happen again. I think you can even hear some relief in her breath before the credits roll. The half and half ending is what I'd actually call the selfish ending, or the have your cake and sell it too ending, or perhaps the oh god, what have I done ending. Esh survives the ordeal and can return home to her people, but at a grave cost. The shining trapezohedron, and by extension the mind of Nyarlathotep, has returned with her. Even if she let herself die in the desert upon realizing this, it wouldn't really matter. Some archaeologist would find the trapezohedron eventually, and the whole cycle would begin anew. We've seen Nyarlathotep is willing to play the long game here, so Esh's fate is completely irrelevant to him. In the Embrace ending, we see Esh is killed by the new body that you, now controlling Nyarlathotep, have completely taken over, and what's left of humanity will die shortly with her as the horrors pour forth into her world. I'm in two minds about whether this is a good ending or not. On the one hand, humans are screwed, but there presumably weren't that many humans left at this point, and the capital C corruption, which I think represents a different outer god, maybe Yog-Sothoth, would have remained too, so they may have been screwed anyway. Esh is a scavenger, and the world is still in ruin centuries after the war between the Eschaton and the Valkyrie. The Valkyrie were imperialistic and made a very bad first contact with the Eschaton peoples, and really it was their hubris that caused their downfall. Part of me feels that the Valkyrie deserve this, but on the other hand, the fallout of their sins shouldn't be placed on the remnants of the surviving humans. On the other hand, the shining trapezohedron has been lying to us for the whole game, so it's hard to judge them fully even after reading all of the lore in the game that I could find. In theory, if the Eschaton are revived in this process, and they begin to populate Ash's world, then they'll get the salvation they finally wished for, at the cost of genociding the entire human race, which would then make them just as bad as the Valkyrie. I don't think there's a middle ground here. This isn't ending well for humans. So on the basis that I am human, and I should be rooting for my own team, I'll say that this is the bad ending. But if I were an Eschaton, I would say this is a pretty sick ending, to be honest. The Eschaton language was created by Kyla Karoff, and all of the spoken Eschaton that we hear in-game was done by Oliver Barrett, the voice of the shining trapezohedron. To my ear, a Welsh person who's dabbled in learning Arabic, I can hear a lot of consonants that sound familiar, but the sentence structure and intonation is closer to German. Karoff didn't want to use any of the languages that directly appear in Lovecraft's work, which don't have any official phonology or alphabets anyway, and instead wanted to try and make something more original. In the end, the language is closer to what's known as an English cipher, though according to a Steam thread that Karoff chimed in on, it seems that once all the dialogue for the game was written, Karoff made a direct translation to Eschaton, and then fine-tuned the word strings to look and sound better for the purpose of recording. For example, the phrase "Hello, Esh" would have been directly encoded to Elwili Esh, but then tweaked to Helvi Esh to sound more natural. There's also an unfortunate reliance on apostrophes that appear to be there just to make the romanization harder to read. Though, to be fair, Lovecraft did this a lot too, with phrases like Funglui Unglaufen Cthulhu Relay Ungla Ungal Vertagen. So it's sort of expected for an Eldritch language to be practically unpronounceable. There's also some, in my opinion, bad choices in the romanization, such as the fact that H's are pronounced like ch in Welsh or Arabic. Again, this seems to just be there to throw off an English speaker's attempt to read it phonetically. In either case, the language is quite unnatural in a linguistic sense, but it fits the bill well enough for what I think most people imagine an ancient outer god-worshipping alien culture might sound like. The soundtrack was once again handled by Max LL, who did a great job of interweaving somber melodies with an ever-present sense of impending doom, relying this time mainly on violins, choral whines, and the occasional electric guitar or traditional sitar, all laced with cave noise and heavy reverb. It's a very ambient soundtrack, but it dynamically shifts between moods depending on where you are in the game. It's actually so good that I honestly didn't even notice it as a soundtrack initially. I just thought it was part of the natural sounds of the catacombs I was exploring. In many ways, some of the ambient works here remind me a lot of Matt Uellemann, and if you know who Matt Uellemann is, then you know that that's pretty high praise. Joanny Gauthier also returns as the game's lead artist, and the animations that her and her team have brought to the table are as beautiful as ever in their own disgusting way. Sundered had a budget about 10 times bigger than Jotun's, reinvesting the success of that game back into the studio, along with a Canadian Creative Media Fund, some industry support from Sony to help with marketing and getting the game a simultaneous release on the PS4, and finally a Kickstarter to get some early feedback and push the project over the finish line, as the time from the end of the Kickstarter until the original release was only 7 months. All of this extra effort and financial support clearly shows through, I think. The game is technically sound. I didn't encounter really any bugs, except for some slowdown when I deliberately farmed hundreds of thousands of shards in the Hall of Bells, a late game horde room, just to see if I could. And one time I died in my second playthrough when the game just froze for like a solid second during a horde attack. Sundered marketed itself as a so-called Metroidvania game, and critics have also classified it as a roguelite. I've also seen it get labelled as a Roguevania, but If you don't know, these are genres that are portmanteaus of other games. Metroid and Castlevania, and Rogue, the 1980 Unix terminal game, respectively. Rogue especially bears almost no physical resemblance to modern so-called roguelikes or roguelites, both in terms of how the games are made and played these days. The only shared feature between Sundered and Rogue is that they have procedurally generated levels. And even then, Rogue is different every time you play it. And there are so many Metroidvanias out there at this point that it seems a bit unfair to me to let Nintendo and Konami still hog all of the glory. And the only thing that Sundered shares with Castlevania is melee combat, power-ups, and exploration. But plenty of games have combat, power-ups, and exploration. The usefulness of these terms have overreached their limit at this point, as far as I'm concerned, along with any other genre that's named after another game. I've seen words like search action bandied about to replace them, but let's save that talk for another time. Sundered was financially successful, as far as I can tell, but critically maligned, especially on YouTube, because of these differences. It's not a very good Metroidvania, and it's not a very good roguelite, but I think if you let your viewpoint get blindsided by established genre names, then you'll only see mediocrity in Sundered. I think at the end of the day, these classifications are somewhat arbitrary, and more often than not are used to the benefit of marketeers, not consumers. Sundered tries to be a high-tension action explorer with Lovecraftian themes and a death-based progression system, and it succeeds well enough at achieving those goals. It's also worth mentioning, though, that another reason why the game wasn't well received on launch was because of, quote, boring combat, which I initially disagreed with until I found out that the original version of the game didn't have the finisher move. Eldritch Edition brought the game to Switch in late 2018, which also pushed a free update to all other platforms. This added 4-player local co-op, some extra perks, the optional boss, a bunch of quality of life improvements like an arrow over your head when the camera pans out in big boss fights, an easy mode, and most importantly, I think, the finisher. So if you want to experience what the game was like on launch, try playing without the finisher for a little while. And I did, and yeah, it's pretty boring. It becomes a lot slower and more repetitive, and you don't take as many risks trying to get extra hits in because there's no point. So it's interesting how this one addition has substantially improved the pacing and feel of the game since launch. It's possible that there are other changes too, but it's been actually really hard to find information about what changed between the original and new editions. So if you've been playing this game since launch, please feel free to chime in the comments with what else was added, and I'll pin an errata comment compiling them all for posterity if needs be. Anyway, in the next video I'll be discussing Spiritfarer, which is a much different kind of game, and potentially also much longer than both Jotun and Sundered combined. At the end, I'll also try to dissect what I think makes Thunder Lotus unique, and what I hope to see from their next game, which at time of writing has yet to be announced. So feel free to subscribe to the channel in the meantime.